objection?
Mr. President, on June 11th, a month and a half ago, in a very strong bipartisan way, the Senate voted 93-3, overwhelming vote, to pass legislation written by Senator John McCain, Republican, and myself to address the crises facing our veterans community and the VA, and to protect and defend the men and women who have put their lives on the line to defend us. And I want to take this opportunity again to thank Senator McCain for his very strong efforts on getting that legislation passed. Mr. President, as you know, the legislation that we passed here was estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, to cost about $35 billion. And at just about the same time, the House of Representatives passed legislation dealing with more or less the same issues, and the bill that they passed in the House was estimated by CBO to cost $44 billion, $9 billion more than what we passed here in the Senate. Now, in the last 6 weeks, my staff, my colleagues, and I have been working very, very hard to refine this legislation, to come up with a more reasonable price tag, and to address the needs of our veterans community in a significant way. Now, in that process, I have been accused by some of, quote-unquote, moving the goalposts. Well, I guess I have. I have moved the goalposts so that the legislation we are introducing today is substantially lower than what passed the Senate and what passed the House. And if that's called moving the goalposts, I suspect that in this case, it's moving the goalpost in a positive direction. In fact, the bill that we are presenting today would cost less than $25 billion. A lot of money, no doubt, but that is some $10 billion less than what we passed here on the Senate floor, and it is $19 billion less than what the House passed. Mr. President, our proposal is a common-sense proposal which deals in a significant way with the needs of the veterans community. What it does is provide emergency funding for contract services so veterans can, when they find themselves on long waiting periods, as in fact is the case in a number of locations around the country, they can go outside of the VA and get private health care or care in a community health center or whatever. They no longer have to wait during this emergency period for long periods of time to get into the VA. I think that that is a very important part of this proposal. It's something we've got to do. And in addition, what we also say is if a veteran is living more than 40 miles from a VA facility, and there are veterans who in some cases are living hundreds of miles away, they don't have to, when they're ill, get in their car and travel for 3 or 4 hours to get health care at a VA. They will be able to go to a non-VA facility, a private physician, if they live more than 40 miles away from a VA facility. And I think that's a significant step forward. But, Mr. President, what our legislation also does is address an issue of huge concern to the veterans community. And just yesterday, I received, and many members in the Veterans Committee received, a letter from 16 major veterans organizations. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to introduce this letter into the congressional record.
Without objection.
16 major veterans organizations, including the Disabled American Veterans, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW, Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Military Officers Association of America, and many other wonderful veterans organizations who have worked for years representing the needs of millions and millions of veterans. And what these organizations say in this letter is that while we must address the immediate crisis of doing away with these long waiting lines and allowing veterans to get private care, what they also say loudly and clearly is that the VA must have the doctors, the nurses, and the space capacity that it needs so that in the future it will be able to permanently eliminate these long waiting lines. So that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when veterans come into the VA, they'll get quality care, they will get timely care. And that is what the veterans organizations have said. And I would just quote to you one small paragraph of a long letter. They say that the charge of the conference committee should be, and I quote, to ensure that all veterans currently waiting for treatment must be provided access to timely, convenient health care as quickly as medically indicated, and at the same time, and I quote, protect, preserve, and strengthen the VA healthcare system so that it remains capable of providing a full continuum of high-quality, timely health care to all enrolled veterans. Last week, in a Senate Veterans Affairs Committee meeting, Sloan Gibson, the acting Secretary of the VA, stated that the VA needed over $16 billion in order to hire thousands and thousands of doctors, nurses, other medical providers. In many VA facilities, doctors do not have the examining rooms that they need. There's space problems all over this country. And what the veterans organizations, 16 of them, said loudly and clearly is that Sloan Gibson, the new acting Secretary of the VA, approved with wide Republican support, they said, we support his proposal. And our legislation does not give the VA all that Mr. Gibson would like, but we do provide them with the doctors and the nurses and the medical staff that they need so that we do not continue to have long waiting lines at VA hospitals all over this country, so that we do not come back here 2 years from now in the same position with veterans not being able to get timely care. Mr. President, I have worked for a month and a half with my House Republican colleagues, led by Veterans Affairs Chairman there, Jeff Miller, to find a compromise. You know, everybody knows House looks at the world different than the Senate. We all know that. And if we go forward, we need a compromise. We have put good faith offers on the table time and time again, and we have tried to meet our Republican colleagues more than halfway. But, Mr. President, I am very sad to say that at this point, and I hope this changes, but at this point, I can only conclude with great reluctance that the good faith we have shown is simply not being reciprocated by the other side. Standing here and saying this is the last thing that I want to be doing, our veterans deserve a responsible solution to this crisis. Last night, just as an example of what's happening, somewhere around 10 o'clock in the night, the co-chairman of the Veterans Conference Committee, Mr. Miller in the House, announced unilaterally, without my knowledge or without my concurrence, that he was going to hold a so-called conference committee meeting in order to introduce his proposals. Needless to say, his proposal is something that I have yet to see. I don't know what it is. This is a proposal that nobody on our side has seen. My understanding is that he then wants to take this to the House on Monday to come up with a vote. In other words, his idea of negotiation is, we have a proposal, take it or leave it. And any sixth grader in a school in the United States understands this is not negotiation. This is not what democracy is about. So, Mr. President, I note the presence on the floor of the co-author of the bill passed here in the Senate, Senator McCain, and I'm happy to yield the floor to Senator McCain.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, could I say that I understand the frustration that the chairman of the committee feels, and this has been, for everyone involved, a very frustrating process. I think to some degree the real effort has been diverted on this whole issue of the pay-fors, of the costs of this legislation. And I fully understand the senator from Vermont, the distinguished chairman of the committee's frustration. I would hope that we could, maybe all of us, cool down some and maybe go to this meeting at noon and ahead of time, as far ahead of time as it's possible, tell the chairman what their proposal is, and also a counter proposal of Senator Sanders would be fully considered by the conference as well. It is the proper process to go to a conference, and unfortunately we only did that once, and that was largely a pro forma kind of activity. And again, I fully appreciate Senator Sanders and who has worked and labored very hard on this very terrible issue. But I hope all of my colleagues recognize that for us to not come to agreement on legislation which is not that dissimilar, which passed this body 93-3, and over on the House side, I believe it was unanimous, is really a gross disservice to those who deserve our consideration most. There's no group of citizens in this country that deserve our help in this time of crisis than our veterans, the men and women who have served. So may I say to my friend from Vermont, who like me is very given to calm deliberation of all issues, we are very similar in that respect, I say, with some humor I hope, I hope that we could go to this conference at noon today and sit down together and listen to the various proposals. And I believe that the fundamentals, as it was passed by this body on a 93-3 vote, should be a basis for largely the final legislation that we reach. And the other body's legislation is strikingly similar. It seems to me where we have the differences is how much additional funding to the fundamentals of the legislation that we are considering. So I was watching my friend from Vermont on the floor here, and I want to say to him, I fully understand his frustration. I hope we will be able to sit down at noon with our both Republican and Democrat on both sides of the aisle, and with the overriding priority of not leaving and going out into an August recess without acting on this issue. Veterans are dying. There's allegations that 40 veterans in my state, the Phoenix VA hospital, died because they didn't receive care. This is not a policy academic issue here. This is the very lives of the men and women who are serving. So I guess for the third time, I would say to my colleague, and I'll yield to him in just a second, I would be more than happy to look at what we have proposed and what is passed to this body as compared to what the other side of the Capitol is proposing, and perhaps we can come to some agreement and compromise, which is the way that we're supposed to pass laws in this body. I'd like the unanimous consent to yield to the senator from Vermont.
Without objection, the senator from Vermont.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Senator McCain again for all of his hard work on this issue. But let me just ask him a few questions. He and I have been talking the last few days. Senator McCain, don't you think, you've been here for 1 or 2 years, that the best way to go forward is for people to sit down at a table and knock out their differences? And then the idea of presenting it to a conference is absolutely right. But you know and I know that what conference committees are largely about are 5-minute speeches. And I have been disappointed that I have not, and I think you will agree with me, maybe not, that the best way forward is for people to sit down in a room and work out their differences, not to go forward with just unilateral statements. That makes sense?
Well, could I say to my friend from Vermont, I believe that it's a matter of simple courtesy that you, as the chairman of the committee, should be asked to come to a meeting with the other major chairman and ranking members of the committees. And I hope that kind of thing doesn't happen again. And what I would like to see, and I beg my colleagues to sit down and let's work this out. It's a matter of money. It's not a matter of the provisions of the bill. And that can't be the reason for us not to reach some agreement. So I intend at noon to attend, and I intend to make a strong case that we would be glad to hear any proposal by the chairman and ranking members on the other side of the Capitol, and that if we would have counter proposal and maybe to start a discussion and dialogue which could reach to, which would lead to an agreement.
Well, let me just ask Senator McCain one more question. And again, thank him very much. He is not on at this moment the Veterans Committee, but he has jumped into this with both feet and is playing a very, very good role. Would you be prepared if, generally speaking, what happens is the chairman and ranking member of the Senate and the House get together? You are not the chairman, you're not the ranking member, but I think you could play a good role. Would you be prepared to sit down with the other 4 members, myself, the other 3, and help us reach a compromise?
I would be more than glad to do that, I'd say to my friend from Vermont, and I'd also like to say that I hope that the participation of a number of people would lead us to some agreement today. Because once we reach an agreement, then of course we have to go through the normal votes and all of the things that require some period of time. And I want to say to my friends who are deeply concerned about the costs here of some of these provisions, my argument is that yes, we should seek ways to pay for as much as we can. And I believe we can compromise on some areas of spending, but we cannot allow that alone to prevent us from acting. So I thank my friend from Vermont, and I look forward to engaging with him, and I think maybe it's important that we show courtesy to all members who are involved in this, including the chairman of the committee. I thank.
One more second. I wanted to just paraphrase, and tell me if I'm misquoting you. I don't have it in front of me. But when we were debating this bill on the floor, you said something to the effect, if this is, and when we're talking about emergency funding, you said something to the effect, if this is not an emergency, I don't know what an emergency is. Is that a correct paraphrase?
That is absolutely my conviction, that the reason why we have emergency funding from time to time in times of crisis is when there's an emergency. And I will repeat again, I do not know of a greater domestic emergency than the care that we owe the men and women who have served this country. I thank my colleague, and I yield the floor.
I thank Senator McCain very much for his statements and for his hard work on this issue, and would reiterate just what he said, and that is my belief. And that is what we passed here on the Senate floor, that if taking care of the men and women who have put their lives on the line to defend us and who came home without arms or legs or without their eyesight, or 500,000 of them who came home with post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury, if that is not an emergency, taking care of those brave men and women, I agree with Senator McCain. I don't know what an emergency is, and I'm happy to yield the floor to my colleague from Alaska, Senator Begich.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.